So let's pull back for a moment, and if you could tell us a little bit about some things that you very eloquently discussed in your work on Buddhism and modernism, which is, what is modernism? What are the basic traits of the modernism? And then step us through a little bit about what are we worried about, many of us, in terms of the kind of modernist project, and how did this shape the reasons that we went to meditation, and then the ways in which we abstracted meditation and adapted it and brought it back here, and how does that lead to the concerns we discussed a little bit before about whether meditation is something that's a positive force within the broader purview of modern times and modernism, or whether it's potentially a co-opted force?
It's a big question.
Yeah. Well, you wrote the book on it, so
Yeah.
Of course I know that was a couple of years ago.
So I think there are a number of different ways you can think of modernism or modernity, and the way I've looked at it is in, I guess, a more kind of cultural sense, as opposed, say, to a purely political sense. I mean, you could look at institutions and political systems of modernity, and what I've been looking at are things that I think are particularly important to Buddhism's reception in the West. And I've tweaked and adopted certain ideas of Charles Taylor to sort of set up my whole framework of modernity. And he identifies certain big, broad ways of thinking that are identified originally with particular historical periods, but really go beyond those periods and become pervasive ways of thinking about things and shaping our sensibilities in the world we live in right now. And these are not just unique to the West now, they've gone global. So the first one would be a kind of naturalistic understanding of the world and a rationalistic understanding, a kind of scientific mentality in which the world is a closed causal system. And that system is we can know that system through rational thought and empirical observation. And then sort of counter to that, you have the Romantic movement, which is very much about emotions. It's about the idea that we have some kind of deep interior self that we can explore, that it's the source of creativity. And you also have a kind of alternative cosmological picture of, rather than the sort of Newtonian mechanistic universe, you have a kind of universe as a living organism and something that is, that is contiguous in a sense with human beings. And then there's also the pervasive influence of Western theism. Particularly, I think, important to Buddhism is Protestant Christianity, because a lot of Buddhist modernism really goes back to texts, and that's a theme that I think Buddhists got from the Christians who were saying, we can have a direct experience of God, we can have a direct experience of reading the texts, and we don't need priests and mediators and things like that. And then I would actually add on to that, I think it deserves a prominent place, that is psychology. I mean, all along the way, Buddhism has been very influenced by psychology, first by analytic psychology, then contemplative or cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and so on. And so Buddhism, in many ways, has become sort of infused into these discourses in various ways at various historical periods, and been able to kind of navigate some of the tensions. For instance, there's this tension that we have in our culture between the scientific worldview and the more romantic, inflected worldview. We want things to be verifiable, we want hard facts, and yet we don't want our souls to be reduced to molecules and chemical reactions and things like that. We want to have some kind of sense of a deep self. And I think, Buddhism is such a broad and diverse tradition that there are things that can be made to speak to those issues. So, I mean, it's a big story of how, I'll talk a little bit later today about how how particularly Buddhist thinkers infused Buddhism into these discourses. But that's kind of the big picture of modernity that I set up. So the other issue is how Buddhism has...
well, let me ask this.
Yeah.
So given that picture, especially if you look at the scientific and the romantic sides, to what degree do you see that in the context of looking at Buddhist meditation, but in general, to what degree do you see that as really being a kind of hidden complicity, or to what degree are they really divergent visions of our future? And before going to Buddhist meditation, then the point of that would be to discuss what are the concerns that we have about that, because you are telling a story in your book about certain implicit hopes we have for how we might work against where that modernism is taking us, and then certain worries that we might have about how the way in which we've adapted Buddhist meditation might end up being complicit in directions that we don't want to go. And so in that sense, what you just discussed as presenting a kind of couple pathways into the future, one that some people have concerns about, another one which is kind of well-worn, but whether or not we continue down that path is the issue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll take one possible path. I said that really the introduction of Buddhism to the West was in its repackaging as a kind of scientific religion, or at least as a religion that was in harmony with science. And so obviously that was sort of being infused into the rationalist paradigm and the rationalist discourse. So now I think that's being recapitulated in much more empirical ways. And now a lot of what the romantic concern has been, and this is not just romantic, I mean we all have this concern. Back when in the late 19th century, when this first move was happening, there was a kind of almost utopian sense of what science was going to do for us. It was going to make everything better. It was going to make us ethically better people. Eugenics was popular. And then as we get into the 20th century, all that is really, to say the least, thrown into question. Science develops, these horrendous weapons of mass destruction. We have atomic bombs, and we have, the factory killing of millions of people. And we have Nazism as the kind of apotheosis of the eugenics movement at that time. So that kind of utopian vision of science just crumbles. And so now I think, late after that, after post-war period, the people who are embracing Buddhism are anti-war protesters in this country, and they're very much on the romantic side, and they're very much questioning the science. Now it seems like it's shifted back to a kind of more scientific view of things. And so we have some of the same kind of questions about how meditation fits into that we have more broadly. That is, are we constructing as a culture a model of the human being that is overly mechanistic, that's overly instrumental, and so that meditation comes along and just becomes kind of a way of working that mechanism a little more efficiently and of achieving our mundane goals of being better workers or whatever. So I think that's one of the concerns, and also just that I think a lot of people in the scientific study of meditation are not really taking adequate account of the cultural elements, the historical elements, and they're just seeing meditation as a kind of technique, and they're implicitly offering a kind of mechanized view of the mind in an uncritical way, and then bringing meditation in as a way to make that mind more efficient and more well-functioning.
And abstracted from all specificity that might resist that.
Exactly.
So we've been talking recently about just religion as a phenomenally important resource of resistance to that particular vision and that particular trajectory into the future, where just the very specificity of being part of that religion with its own idiosyncratic cosmology, idiosyncratic view of the past and the future and the present, and the whole thing being so interlocking in terms of one's values, one's identities, one's practice, the formation of communities and so forth. And given that that's this bastion of resistance, whether it's evangelical Christians or Catholics or Muslims or Jews or Buddhist in Burma or wherever it might be, then some people have seen meditation as really being this tool, this modern adaptation of meditation, as being a tool that's trying to dismantle that resistance by effectively co-opting the religious impulse by saying, oh, we have something better. It's called spirituality, or it's called contemplation. So let go of your quirky, medieval kinds of assumptions of what religion is or what human possibility is, and adapt this new one. And by the way, this new one has really no context whatsoever, but we'll be happy to provide those contexts to you in the corporate culture that we've designated as your appropriate locus on this planet Earth. And then, so that whole way in which meditation has become bundled together with this dismissive attitude towards religion, this dismissive attitude towards the importance of cultural context, culturally laden, culturally baggage, all that stuff that we use to talk in dismissive fashions about that. And this focus on bare attention and putting off to the side the more judgmental, the more analytical, the things that basically put that practice into a much broader kind of world, then it leaves open that world for them to shape.
Right.
So,
yeah. Really, at the core of Buddhist meditation, and you see this in the earliest meditation text, is you're trying to bring to awareness something that was there but was blind to you before, you know, and not just in a kind of neutral scientific way, but in a way that is oriented towards some kind of liberative goal. And so now we have in the modern world, you know, different ideas of liberation, but I think that because there is that fundamental form of at least certain kinds of meditation, that it is meant to uncover things that are hidden and to take what is uncovered and do something with it and move a kind of ethical project forward. You know, that I think it does resonate with a lot of the more, I think positive elements of modernity that are oriented towards liberation, not only from, you know, oppressive political circumstances, but also of oppressive psychological circumstances and so on. So in that sense, you know, I think it can be a liberative tool that resonates with modernity and in some of its larger projects, and also might be able to contribute new things to it. And I think that's important, that in the modern appropriation of these kinds of techniques, that we remain open to the idea that it's not just, you know, we have our orientation, we have what we're doing, and this thing out here will help, but rather, you know, see if that whole tradition that these techniques are coming from have anything to offer, have any kind of new ideas and new ethical stances and new doctrines that we might consider useful. And I think when we have a kind of narrowly scientific view of the mind, for instance, that can be a block, because that becomes a very ideological, almost a kind of dogmatic religious position in and of itself.
Mindfulness has achieved this rich identity in and of itself now, separate from Buddhism, separate from meditation even. And that short definition of mindfulness, present-centered, non-judgmental awareness, has a rich culture all of its own now. Although I think it's very difficult to describe that in any great detail, because it's that movement right now, it's very good at erasing its tracks. It's very difficult to historicize our own moment, right? In the sense of asking, how did we get here? Right? And what are the contours? But if you look at what mindfulness is doing around the world, I wonder if we can get some insights about what it's doing here. So I'm thinking about Bhutan, for instance, where mindfulness is a discrete form of meditation, and it's very honestly and self-consciously coming from outside of Bhutan, but it's a live issue now. And one of the things, it's considered Buddhist by pedigree, if not necessarily by contemporary practice, in terms of contemporary practice, but what it's giving now at a public level in Bhutan, it's given people a chance to ask, okay, to the extent that meditation was and is a part of Buddhism, is our Buddhist culture in Bhutan going to yield practices and ideas and values that are going to be a part of contemporary Bhutan, they're going to be a part of the future of Bhutan? And to what extent are they going to be a part of public life as opposed to monastic life?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's inserted itself, or it's been inserted into a really dynamic conversation about the role of religion in society in Bhutan. I imagine that's happening in other places too.
Yeah, I think it is, and you know, this is a part of the what some people have called the pizza effect.
Mm-hmm.
You know, something from someplace comes over to the West and gets taken up by powerful people, influential people, and reconfigured in some ways, then gets re-imported back to the indigenous culture, and it becomes, you know, this is what we were all about all along. Or maybe it becomes something that, you know, kind of revalorizes something that was there all along, and gives them a sense of pride, and you know, that this is a contribution that we've made. And I guess one of the dangers is that it can become a kind of, in a roundabout way, a kind of Western export that can take up a lot of the space that indigenous aspects of culture previously took up. And you know, maybe that's okay, and maybe not. I think it depends on the place and what it's displacing. But I think you know, we need to be aware of that in how we talk about things like mindfulness. And I think because it's got this sort of weight of scientific discourse behind it, you know, it gets reflected back to the cultures which ultimately are the sources of them as, oh, well, okay, this is the really legitimate part of our own tradition, and so therefore we can kind of leave the rest of the tradition behind. But I don't think it's really quite substantial enough to replace the rest of the tradition. And this is one of the things that I think still hasn't really sunk in about religion and about meditation and about secularism in the West, is that it's not really just about individuals, and it's not really about just beliefs. You know, a lot of the critique of religion that you see among the new atheists and everything, it sort of has a very narrow definition of religion as believing all kinds of silly things and killing lots of people based on those silly beliefs. But in fact, those beliefs have very, you know, they're embedded in much broader networks of community, of culture. They have functions and purposes beyond just kind of an empirical thing, like, well, is it true or not that my ancestors are still around and I can pray to them? You know, there's a whole network of a whole social network that's embedded in, that has value. And I think when we sort of take some aspect of an Asian culture and re-import it to that culture and say, well, here's what's real about your tradition, and here's what's authentic, and here's what's scientifically proven, you can let the rest go. That's kind of naive culturally.